I actually end up looking at this as more of a risk that we won't have enough workers. But if you look at it from the worker perspective, yeah, we might double or triple the size of our electricity grid. So it's an enormous opportunity. Renewable energy and energy storage jobs is and should be very appealing to workers.
Welcome to another episode of the Environment in Canada podcast. I'm Conor, Head of Communications, and today I'm going to be talking with Vittoria Bellissimo about renewable energy in Canada, where we are in terms of renewable energy in Canada, what this means for jobs in the future, what this means for our economy. We're also going to get into a bit about how renewable energy can be a reliable solution for the Canadian electricity grid and what needs to be done at different levels of government in order to encourage renewable energy growth. Before we begin, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, and on CHMA Radio in Sackville, New Brunswick on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Atlantic Daylight Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe so you get the latest episodes from us. Hi, Vittoria. How's it going?
Yeah, it's all right. How are you? Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining. For those who are joining us today and listening in, who are you and what do you do?
Sure. So my name is Vittoria Bellissimo, and I'm the president and CEO of the Canadian Renewable Energy Association, or CanREA for short. We are the voice of the wind energy, solar energy, and energy storage solutions that will power Canada's energy future. CanREA represents more than 300 member companies in these industries, active coast to coast, including manufacturers, installers, developers, service providers, and supply chain partners. And through stakeholder advocacy and public engagement, we work to create the conditions for a modern energy marketplace in which clean, low-cost, reliable, flexible, scalable solutions play a central role in transforming Canada's energy mix.
That sounds really cool. And I guess on that note, this is a big question. I think people are a little bit vague on where we are as a country in terms of that transition to renewable energy. And so when we talk about the renewable energy transitioning, where are we in terms of progress and what obstacles maybe still exist?
Okay, I've got a long-winded answer here for you with a series of stats, so feel free to take what you want. But from a Canadian perspective, we come from a very impressive starting place. We have a very clean electricity system overall, thanks to some largely legacy hydroelectric assets, although we have some significant provincial outliers. So from the top, Canadians consumed approximately 640 terawatt hours of electricity in 2022. We're a little behind on our stats here. Over 60% of that was hydro, 17.5% was from fossil fuels, 13% was from nuclear, and notably 5.7% was from wind, 1.5% was from biofuels, and 1.1% was from solar PV. So we have quite a bit of work to do. Again, from a global perspective, Canada accounts for approximately 1.6% of global GHG emissions, and we're around the 10th largest global emitter. Electricity accounts for approximately 6.7% of Canada's GHG emissions, and according to the National Inventory Report on GHG sources and sinks in Canada, GHG emissions in the electricity sector are falling rapidly, particularly in Alberta. Overall, Canadian electricity-related emissions are now 47 megatons, which is down almost 60% from 2005 levels. So if you want to hear a little bit about renewables and energy storage, we could talk about the growth that we've seen in that in the past couple years.
Sure, I'd be interested to know, because I think that's the thing. Like most people, we hear, we sort of have a sense that there are emissions reductions happening. We know they're happening in different places, but I'm curious, what's the specifics on renewables within that?
Sure. So every January, we release a data report, and I would encourage all of your listeners to go and check it out every January. And if I'm looking back to 2022, we saw 10.5% growth in new installed capacity in wind, solar, and storage across Canada. And that was fairly consistent last year as well. In 2023, we saw 11.2% growth, which brings us to a new total of 21.9 gigawatts of wind energy, solar energy, and energy storage in Canada. But it does fall short of the trajectory that we need to meet net zero targets. And
Yeah.
earlier you asked about obstacles, and I would maybe turn that question around a little bit and say, what is it that we need in order to build the clean, reliable, affordable power system we need going forward? And it's stable policy and regulatory environments, Indigenous equity partners, supportive communities that welcome projects, and revenue streams for these technologies that look attractive to investors.
Mm-hmm. And I guess that ties into the next question, because are there things that at the federal or provincial levels, or maybe even municipal, if that applies here, that could be done to help move things forward in this respect?
Sure. Overall, I would just let's start with overall obstacles and then we can get into federal, provincial.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
there is a lot of political uncertainty right now. We could talk about the clean electricity regulations, carbon pricing in the US, the Inflation Reduction Act, and what will happen with the US election, and then our investment tax credits here. We've got some supply chain uncertainty. We've got siting and permitting issues. We've got workforce issues. So there's a lot going on in these sectors that will really impact how we get things done. And if you want to take it and break it down between federal and provincial levels, federally, I think there really is a lot to celebrate, particularly around the implementation of investment tax credits or ITCs. So CanREA celebrated Bill C-59 passing in June, which implemented the long-awaited clean technology investment tax credit, or we call it the clean tech ITC. And this allows companies investing in renewable energy and energy storage projects to recoup between 20 and 30% of their capital costs as a refundable tax credit. So we think that ITCs will drive momentum for renewable energy and energy storage in Canada, and it will make Canada a more competitive place to invest, creating new opportunities for our members, helping us compete with the US. So that's the federal perspective. Provincially, it's really important to realize that when we talk about electrification and digitization of the economy, we're talking about significant expansions of our electricity grids. So Canada needs to stay competitive in this rapidly digitizing global economy, and that will really depend on having more generating capacity and more energy. And so provincial grids across Canada really are looking at that right now and trying to figure out if they have enough. And just for context, there was an IEA report that stated that electricity consumption from data centers, artificial intelligence, and cryptocurrency could more than double by 2026. So we are looking at significant load growth in a way we haven't before. And in order to meet that demand, we're going to need more of everything in all the provinces in Canada. So more generation, more transmission, more distribution. And I would say that hydro-dominated jurisdictions will have a much easier time of it than predominantly fossil fuel-based jurisdictions. But everybody across Canada will need to build. So vertically integrated Crown Corps and system operators like in Ontario will be running procurements. And what we need there is predictable procurement schedules. And in an open market like Alberta, what we need to do is be very, very clear with the rules of the game and allow buyers to continue to buy clean electricity if that's what they want. And I have mentioned this, but from a carbon perspective, not all systems are the same, right? There are jurisdictions, including Alberta, Saskatchewan, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick, that will have a harder time of it because they are more reliant on fossil fuels than other grids across Canada.
Right. And so, it's interesting. One of our other episodes is actually on sustainable website design, because we went through a whole internal website design and we worked with a firm and we were trying to minimize, which, at the time it was, I didn't realize websites contribute this much to energy, and this is kind of cool. We can make our website more accessible. But it's interesting that you actually note digitization and computing power as one of the big power requirements of the future. I don't think it's something that maybe people still think about much, and being the thing we are going to be powering with a lot of energy.
Yeah, I mean, I've had the good fortune to be able to attend some conferences on this topic, and in recent times we are starting to see that one of the limiting factors in the implementation of AI is going to be access to clean, reliable, affordable electricity. And I live in Calgary, Alberta, and there are 400 megawatt data warehouses that may be built here. And they need several things. One is the electricity, but they need fiber optic cable. They need, 100 employees, so they need to be close enough to, an urban center where employees can live. They need water for cooling, which is a real consideration. So we're going to see where that goes, but it is system operators and ministers of electricity across Canada are thinking, do I have enough power that I can let these data centers in?
And there's one other aspect I just want to touch on in what you just said. I've heard in certain jurisdictions, because you mentioned workforce requirements, like having people to actually fulfill jobs. I've heard in certain areas where there's actually not enough people in trades, for instance, to make up the demand for some of these projects that are going to be looking for labor. If you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, we have a whole group on our team that does operations. So they look at projects that are in service, and they also run an operations summit. And every year we talk about important things like workforce and what do we need to do to build the workforce of the future. So I do have a few stats for you. It's important to bring data when you come on a podcast. So Canada's most recent data release notes that in 2023, Canada's wind and solar industries accounted for more than 4,950 person years of employment. That's up from 4,460 in 2022 and 2,400 in 2021. So last year it increased by 11%. We have a job site called Clean Energy Jobs Canada, where we're trying to help advertise the jobs that are out there. 130 good jobs in renewables across Canada listed right now. So go check it out if you're job hunting. But we spend a lot of time worrying about the bottlenecks. And one of the bottlenecks is we don't have enough people. We don't have enough training programs for those people. So with the state of the industry growing as it is, we need to get ahead of that problem. And then we need to retain people in the industry too. I had the good fortune to moderate a panel on workforce at our Operations Summit 2 years ago. And it turns out that wind techs, the average time span in that job is about 7 years. There's lots of reasons for it, but we need to be able to keep people in the role longer, keep them satisfied, and keep them healthy and happy in those roles longer going forward.
Yeah, that is interesting. On that note, there's a lot of misinformation out there on renewables, and I'm curious, what are some of the big things that you're seeing that you'd want to address?
Yeah, so I would start out by saying it's very unfortunate, the level of misinformation out there right now, not just limited to renewables and energy storage. To combat this misinformation, we really need to be able to provide clear, accurate, and accessible information. So I think that educational initiatives and communication strategies can help clarify misconceptions and highlight some of the significant benefits of renewable energy. But since you asked, can try today on your podcast to set the record straight on a few commonly misunderstood points about renewables and storage. So the first one I would say is affordability. We hear all sorts of things about, oh, it's too expensive. We can't do it. It's too expensive. And I will tell you that renewables are the lowest cost energy solutions in the world today. And those costs have dropped dramatically in my career. And it's been really interesting to watch. And I brought some numbers for you today just so we can compare different technology types. So onshore wind costs, and this is levelized cost of energy. It comes from 2024 Lazard analysis. Onshore wind ranges from $27 a megawatt hour to $73. Utility scale solar PV ranges from $29 to $92. Utility scale standalone 4-hour 100 megawatt storage, because I had to pick one to share, ranges from $170 per megawatt hour to $296. And I'll point out that we don't use storage flat out. We use it at times when we need it on peak. And nuclear is $142 to $222, and natural gas combined cycle starts at $45 and runs to $108. So there are large ranges, and there's lots of reasons for the large ranges, but renewables and storage are really affordable options in the world today, and it would be nice if we could clear up that misconception.
A lot of the misinformation that I remember being about renewables, having been doing climate communications of some kind now for, over a decade, and like specifically on this sort of range of issues, a lot of it seems to be around affordability, practicality.
Well, my second area of misinformation that I worry about a lot is reliability. So people have these hot takes that reliability is something that depends on one technology alone. And we look at that one technology in isolation, and that's just not how power systems operate. So to clear it up, it's a complicated topic, but I would tell you that reliability is how well your entire supply portfolio and your enabled demand resources perform. People act surprised that it's not always windy and sunny. I tell you that we are getting better and better at forecasting output from renewable energy resources. The best analogy that I've heard on this topic, and I borrowed it from a conference that we ran in Calgary last year, is that you wouldn't water your lawn in a rainstorm. So renewables are sort of the same, right? Let's take all of the electricity we can from the sun and the wind when they're available. And it really is a paradigm shift in that we are now in the age of abundant, affordable, variable resources. And when they're available, they're the least expensive thing there. And we need to integrate that into our power systems. In the future, renewables will not be the only supply source. It will be part of the solution. We will have mixes of resources that provide capacity, energy, and ancillary services to ensure we have a reliable power system. And as examples of those technologies in the future, we will have long duration energy storage, combustion turbines with new fuels, demand response, short-term storage like batteries that we are working on growing today, and distributed energy resources. We'll have transmission to enable geographic diversification of resources, interties. We might even have nuclear if it doesn't have to compete on price in an energy market. So we will be looking at a diverse supply mix. And I don't like the egg analogy, but you never put all your eggs into one basket. We need a diverse supply mix for reliability going forward.
We had a couple of people come on actually to chat about some of the things that happened in Alberta recently with renewables and some of the information around that. And the transmission element came up as like a really key aspect of just making a renewable energy future work, was just having good transmission between locations. Because as you say, if it's sunny in one place and there's power over there, then that can help offset if it's maybe not as sunny in another place or not as windy, and vice versa, right? So it seems like a really interesting systems approach that needs to be taken.
Absolutely.
At the community level, we often see concerns about renewable energy projects, and some of those concerns are very legitimate and might apply to any large scale project, like placement and what are the on the ground environmental impacts going to be. What do you see with that? How should industry engage with communities in this respect? How is this best addressed and talked about and worked on?
Yeah, so there are very clear community engagement principles that we try to emphasize with our members. So I would start by saying that concerns that communities have are valid, and it's essential for companies to recognize that concerns are valid and they should be addressed with transparency and respect. And by actively listening to community members and involving them early in the project lifecycle, companies can ensure that their voices are heard and the input is validated and valued. I think open communication and collaboration are really important. Communication is clearly key to building trust and understanding, and collaborating with local organizations and stakeholders is crucial. Partnerships with local groups can help build trust and ensure that projects align with community values and priorities. And here again, I think there is a role that misinformation has played in making things worse than they really need to be. One last piece of misinformation that we deal with a lot is, how much land will be needed for this solar project, for example. I have a colleague at the University of Calgary who did a study looking at Alberta specifically, but how much agricultural land would be needed if we were going to build solar here, enough to hit our net zero solar future. And she concluded that less than 0.1% of all agricultural land would be required to host a net zero solar future in Alberta. So this misinformation gets blown out of proportion very frequently. There are a ton of benefits of communities hosting wind and solar and energy storage projects. And I've got a little bit of data for you here today. So the community benefits, and I just picked an example project. This is a very large project, but you can scale it up and scale it down. The benefits of a 100 megawatt wind facility in Alberta include $175 million in project development and construction, more than 300 job years in construction. The benefits of a 100 megawatt solar PV facility include $125 million in investment, approximately 200 full-time equivalent jobs in construction. And there are many other community benefits of a 100 megawatt renewable project, including roughly $1 million in annual property taxes for host communities and roughly $500,000 to landowners. So I do think while we're talking about these projects, we need to be very clear about what the benefits are, as well as what the community values and what they're looking for.
We've done a lot of work with communities. Actually, our Atlantic chapter in particular has been working on this, promoting the concept of renewable energy democracy. So for communities that want to take greater control of their energy supply chain through renewables, are there resources out there that they can be referring to, maybe guides or things that might help?
Yeah, so there's a lot happening in this space. There's some good examples in Canada. There's some good examples in internationally. I've got a couple of good examples from Canada here to share, but I would say that we have a Go Solar Guide. You can go to the CanREA website and you can look up Go Solar Guide, and it's a resource that should help homeowners and small business owners understand the ins and outs of installing solar PV. Covers everything Canada needs to know when deciding to go solar, including determining solar potential, net metering, incentive programs, financing your installation, and questions to ask installers. A lot more. It's available for free, and we'll keep it free on our website. We also have a directory on our website that shows everyone who's working in this space. So if you need to find contacts, it should be a fairly easy way to do that. And then I would highlight a couple of examples in Canada that are really interesting. In Yukon, remote communities that are not connected to the electricity grid are generally primarily powered by diesel generators, but some are now converting to solar for the summer months. So the largest and best known example is probably the Old Crow Indigenous community. It's a solar project that includes 900 kilowatts of solar panels and 350 kilowatt hours of battery storage. And actually back in August of 2021, apparently their diesel generators were shut off for the first time in over 50 years. So there's lots of examples like that. Summerside PEI is another one. They have a solar and battery energy storage project. The capacity for the solar is 21.6 megawatts, and they have a 10 megawatt, 20 megawatt hour storage to accompany that. And it allows Summerside to meet more than 62% of its needs with renewable energy. And I think we'll continue to see other good examples of this, of communities that have decided to take a leadership role and they're following through on it.
Well, it's funny you mentioned the Old Crow example. I was living in the Yukon for 2 years prior
No
to
way.
this
Really?
job. And I think it was around the time that I took this job that it was the Old Crow project was in the news as one of the first things that came on my radar as I was making the transition and working. Great examples to see, I think, when we see communities doing that. You touched on this a little bit earlier, but are there other benefits to renewables for workers that we're already seeing in Canada?
I actually end up looking at this as more of a risk that we won't have enough workers. But if you look at it from the worker perspective, yeah, we might double or triple the size of our electricity grid. So it's an enormous opportunity for new folks to get involved in the electricity space. I quoted some numbers earlier, but the sheer number of renewable energy and energy storage jobs is and should be very appealing to workers. There's a lot of opportunity right now and even more coming up as provinces scale up deployment to reach their net zero targets. So again, we have a Clean Energy Jobs website. Check it out if you're in the market for a career shift or if you're looking for jobs in the clean energy space. And part of our mission at CanREA is to help build the clean energy workforce of the future. So we are hard at work at that, and we run an operations summit every year. We just ran our last one in April in Calgary, and it's an opportunity to talk about things like, do we have the workforce we need, and what do we have to do to fix that if we don't? It's exciting to work in electricity at this time while we're making the biggest change that any of us working in this sector have ever seen. So stay tuned for more excitement and more challenges along the way. And I would say the industry needs to be ready for them, but we're moving in the right direction. We just need to pick up the pace.
Vittoria, thank you for joining me today.
No, thank you.
Before we continue, Conor Curtis, Head of Communications, here to chat about the Harbinger network of podcasts to which the Environment in Canada podcast is a member. And I'd like to take a quick moment to shout out another show on the Harbinger network. Cited is doing a mini-series on the legacy of the 1989 Exxon Valdez oil spill. It happened in 1989, but that's not when the story ended. Locals sued Exxon and they won. But 13 years later, that victory was taken away from them. That happened in part because Exxon funded their own research. These ideas quietly transformed how the legal system came to understand the spill, and have curtailed our ability to punish environmental wrongdoing decades into the future. Cited Podcast investigates the forgotten legacy of the Exxon Valdez disaster. That's at citedpodcast.com. So now we're going to dive into our Q&A section for this episode, and before we get into it, I just want to quickly say that any of the views we express here in this Q&A are purely on behalf of ourselves and not the guests that we have on the episode. We've had a few people write in asking questions about hope in relation to the environmental movement and to the situations where we find ourselves in today. And I want to take a few minutes here to go over some of the mechanics, how hope works, and why maybe people aren't feeling as hopeful, and what we can do about it, how we can approach hope as a concept, because it's a vitally important concept if we're going to keep doing the work that many of the people listening to this podcast are doing. And so I think, first of all, to talk about where hope can be threatened within environmentalism, I want to talk about three things, which is, number one, hope becomes hard to have when you have hard to define outcomes of what success looks like. So, we're fighting climate change and biodiversity loss. What does that actually mean? What does that look like? Those are abstract concepts, and they have very realistic impacts, but they're multifaceted impacts. So is success that we save a small area from a climate impact, or we save a particular species, or what is success that we solve the systemic things? And I'd argue, and I think that most people here are going to agree, that we need to fix the systemic things, because if we just end up picking one battle or another, or trying to save one area or another, we're not going to succeed that way. These are systemic issues, so they need to be addressed systemically. But that leads to its own obstacle, which is, okay, what do we mean by systemic issue, right? How do we deal with policy at a national, international level to change it, to address these topics? All of that is very abstract at times, and I think that that's one thing that creates a sense of hopelessness when we face off against these issues. Another thing that I think generates hopelessness is this perception that we can have that we're alone in what we're doing in the environmental movement, that other people don't support us, or that other people don't see things the same way, or that other people aren't fundamentally concerned about the same things that people in the environmental movement are concerned about. And I don't think that's true. I think fundamentally we're all concerned about similar things. We all have similar base concerns. What we're concerned about is defined by how we see the world, and that's where the environmental movement comes in, right? To bring the perspective of the environment and why it's so important. And that's where a lot of our work is dedicated. And all this, of course, ties into that general overwhelming sense of, overwhelmingness. We're facing things that seem overwhelming at times. There's also just a thing of being swamped in negative news about environmental topics that makes it very hard to figure out if we're making any success at all. If you've got hard to define outcomes and the perception of being alone, that's a big struggle to face, but it gets worse when all you see are negative stories, negative things that are happening, how you're not succeeding. And I want to talk about that in a moment as to how we can deal with that and address that as a bigger topic. But first of all, I want to talk about those outcomes. There are ways that we can create better outcomes. One thing is about to define what we actually want as an outcome in terms of the work that we're doing. Having a good goal that's actually achievable, that we know is strategically possible, is important. And that doesn't mean, by the way, doing the lowest common denominator on the list. There might be things that are possible that seem impossible. And it's important to go do those things, because when you succeed at that, that sets a precedent that pushes the bar forward for people to do even more. So it is important to shoot for the stars, but to have a knowledge for which star you're shooting for. And focusing goals that support multiple efforts at once is another way that you can maximize your impact. Right? Instead of just going, I'm going to support this one cause that has this one only outcome that is the thing that I'm aiming for. Why not support a cause where all the work that you're going to be doing is going to help achieve multiple outcomes? This is a big part of our work at Sierra Club Canada, right? We don't just try to do one thing. We try to do many things through singular places where we can throw a lot of energy. A good example of this is the rights of nature, right? Where this is a legal concept that we are pushing for, something that would actually give natural spaces rights underneath the law, and that in turn would help us achieve a lot of different things. We had a great podcast episode called Start Thinking About Things Getting Better, in which we talked about the rights of the Gatineau River with guests, and one of the things they brought up was the fact that discussions about the rights of nature are also leading to discussions about truth and reconciliation in Canada that wouldn't have happened if it hadn't have been for that discussion of the rights of nature. And that's really cool. That's something I didn't even know about prior to being a part of that interview. And it was good to see that, to see different things that we want to achieve being achieved in one place with one push for one thing. There are lots of things out there we can be doing that have overlap with other people's struggles. And it's not to say that there are singular solutions to those struggles. These struggles are extremely complex. But it is to say that we can be doing things that mutually support each other and that build a better world for everybody at the same time. These are important ways to think about maximizing your effort and having outcomes that are going to be more productive, having outcomes that are going to be easier to be able to look back on and say, well, maybe we didn't achieve everything we set out to do, but we achieved a bunch of positive things. There are times in activism when you can win the war even if you lose the battle. And it is important to keep sight of that wider picture of what was achieved, because having multiple goals that are defined but are multiple gives you that possibility to have a lot of impacts that you don't necessarily see, and to appreciate the unexpected victories of things and the evolution of movements too. Not every movement stays the same or focuses on the same thing over time. A lot of activism in Newfoundland and Labrador came from things like the Occupy movement, which was not at all what it ended up turning into. There were people who were concerned about media who formed an independent magazine. There were people who were concerned about fracking in the communities who ended up going off and working with that. And a lot of that had a basis, funnily enough, in a singular movement that existed at one point, but that evolved. Those same people who were involved in that, who made connections through that, went on to go do other things. And so even if the main goal wasn't necessarily what was achieved through it, there were other things that happened as a result. And this is going to come back into something else that I want to talk about, which is community. And the basis of community is often in being for things. Jessica Murray did a great podcast recently with Isaac Murdoch about being for things rather than against things. That doesn't mean not being against things, by the way. That just means putting the emphasis on being for something, like for protecting a river. Community is important because, again, if you feel alone, it's very easy to lose hope. When we talk about community too, like, what are we talking about? If we talk about the community of the same few people that you talk to every week about the same issues that you already all agree on, that can be important in the sense of that's maybe a mutual support network for you. And that's not to say that that isn't something valuable, but there's something beyond that, which is the expansive community and the solidarity and the reaching out to others who maybe aren't normally people who you would talk to. Realizing people are on your side, or that they very least share common concerns, is important. One of the biggest issues we have in Canada in terms of climate change is that a lot of Canadians, most Canadians, are very concerned about climate change. They think other Canadians aren't concerned about climate change. And when you think other people aren't concerned, whether that's right or wrong, you don't speak up. You don't talk about it. You don't reach out to other people about it. You don't bring it up as a topic. You don't seek out other people. Or if you see somebody else bringing it up, you maybe don't feel like being a part of that and talking with them because you're afraid of what other people in that room might think. So the more that you expand community, the more that you talk about these issues, the more that you break that barrier of, yes, actually, people do care about this issue. That creates a lot of space for other people to come in. And it creates a lot of space for yourself as well to have that. And that doesn't mean, by the way, speak up in every situation about climate change. And there are clearly people who will never agree on topics like that. And you don't want to waste energy on that either. Again, we've talked about this in the past, not wasting energy on people you cannot convince. But definitely getting outside of the people who you already talk to about these issues and talking to people who are on the fence or who share some of those concerns but are afraid to talk about it. Those are people to connect to. And it's important to go do that. And when we're building that sense of community, another thing to keep in mind is that gives us a chance to share lessons learned on things we did in the past. Whether we're part of campaigns, environmental campaigns, or part of environmental struggles that we learned from, we can share that when we have a community. And we want to be sharing not just what didn't work, but also what worked. And this is where I want to talk about too, again, thinking about the things that succeed, talking about those unexpected victories, talking about how you got to them, maybe, or even the expected ones, what worked, because that's just as valuable to people as what didn't work. that gives them a roadmap to actually go do something. We're going to be focusing on a lot of more good news stories in the next little while, and as part of our communications at Sierra Club Canada. I think that that's important, and it's something that we need more of. We're not necessarily going to be covering everything in a positive light, because there are things that are nuanced. There are bad news stories as well. We're going to be having a podcast coming up that's going to chat a bit more from critical side on AI, and that's going to be an interesting one to listen into. I hope that you check that out. There's so much there, though, that is working, that we are seeing change. We are seeing an economic shift to renewable energy. How we define that shift, how communities have control over that shift, is going to be vitally important. That's a big question now. But we are seeing that shift. That is something to be hopeful about. That is a victory. At the end of the day, if you can't find hope in any of the things that I just talked about, ask yourself a question. If everything was hopeless, would you do anything less? I've found often that in points where I just can't see hope, or I just can't see the light at the end, asking yourself what you would do differently can be helpful. Because maybe there is something you would do differently. Maybe you need some time off. Maybe, on the other hand, you wouldn't change anything at all. Sometimes the situations we face in life are just absurd situations. They're neither hopeful nor pessimistic. They're just absurd. They're ridiculous. There's things happening that shouldn't be happening, or shouldn't be happening the way that they're happening. It goes as much for things that are bad as for things that are good. If I look back on most of the victories that I feel, or most of the positive things that I feel I've done, rarely happened the way that I thought it was going to happen. And there's something beautiful to that, and frankly kind of funny to that. Absurdity isn't pessimistic or idealistic. It doesn't make a call one way or the other, but it can be a way to look at the world and to laugh at it and to say, we've got to keep going anyway. I hope that what I've said today is helpful. And I want to leave by saying something that's important from our perspective, which is we're stronger together. That, at its core, is what our work is about. It's what any grassroots movement is about, but it's what we try to strive to bring to the environmental movement. And I hope it's something that you're seeing in the work that you're getting from this and from this podcast. And if you have more questions, or if you just want to reach out and with a problem and say, this is a problem I've got, how do I fix this? We're happy to be there to answer those questions. I'd highly recommend, too, that you check out another podcast Jessica did with Eric McBay entitled Full Spectrum Resistance. It's a great segue from some of the things I talk about here into some organizing strategies and ways of thinking about how we work together as environmental movements, so please do go check that out. Before we end today, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions, events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM bi-weeklies on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. ET. And on CHMA Radio in Sackville, New Brunswick on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Atlantic Daylight Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe so you get the latest episodes from us.